Hey, good afternoon, friends. Today, my friends, is Tuesday, June the 30th, 2026, and the time now is 3:30 p.m. So, friends, the World Cup of upset continues. So many upsets have been occurring for the past 2 days now. The first one, we had South Africa and Canada, and then Paraguay and Germany, and then Netherlands and Morocco. Friends, today I want to talk about the World Cup 2026. And I want to talk briefly and specifically about Norway and Ivory Coast. Once again, the World Cup of upset continues. So, friends, I just finished watching the game, the round of 32 match between Ivory Coast, representing Africa, and Norway, representing Europe. So, yesterday saw two European countries, Germany and you have the Netherlands, being eliminated from the World Cup 2026. And finally, one European country was able to go through, and that's Norway. Now, the game between Ivory Coast and Norway was honestly a very competitive game. However, I think African countries are much better than they are playing in this World Cup, even though they are playing a lot. They are playing very good, as we saw with the game between Morocco and the Netherlands yesterday, which I'm going to talk about in another video. However, friends, in terms of the game between Norway and the Ivory Coast, at the beginning, the very beginning of the first half, Norway basically had the ball, the majority of the possession, and they were basically slapping Ivory Coast all over the place. Basically, they possessed the ball, they controlled the ball for the majority of the time. Let's say within the first maybe 15 minutes of the game. Perhaps we can say that Ivory Coast probably was scared, they were intimidated, but they are much better. Now, Norway scored, I think if I can remember, right before the end of the first half. Norway scored. And it was very interesting. It is a goal that whenever I watch European football, whether we are talking about the professional leagues in Europe or European countries when they play game, the most perhaps popular common goals that they score basically pertains to them scoring, basically hat trick and whatever. They kicking for goal. However, it seems African countries or teams, they want to dribble to the opposing team's backs. Once again, African teams seem to want to dribble everybody, the opposing defenders, and dribble the ball to the opposing team's box, penalty box, and score. That is something that I grew up watching when I was a young kid in Africa. Basically, offensive player, okay, or strikers want to dribble the whole field and score. That is not the case, and I feel that Africa should get away from that. And for some reason, it seems that African players who have been playing in Europe and elsewhere seem to get the memo. However, perhaps we can say many of the African players who are not playing in the stronger European leagues probably do not get the memo. Or friends, when African teams playing European teams, they want to dribble all the way to the opposing team's goal and score, which should not be the case. However, the game between Ivory Coast and Norway Once Norway scored, it seems that Ivory Coast became a little bit timid within the first 2 to 5 minutes. However, they began to play. And we began to see, or I began to see, the force in their play. And they begin to play master class, play as if they are a competitor, as if they can win the game. And they play a very good game. However, if I can remember, I think within the 70th minute, okay, the 60 something, the 70th minute, Ivory Coast equalized. And it was a very good goal. And in this case, you have an African player representing Ivory Coast, basically kicking for goal. Yes, he was able to dribble his way into the Norwegian half, or the Norwegian goal, basically dribbled two defenders and score and kick for goal. Now, I was very much disappointed as an African. I am very proud and happy for Ivory Coast, and I want them or any African country to succeed, as Morocco did yesterday. Morocco basically made me proud and made, I believe, all of Africa, or the majority of Africa, proud. Even though there has been some contentious relationship between Morocco and Black Africa. Honestly, the majority of Africa, all of Africa, are proud. So finally, one African country, in this case Morocco, have advanced to the round of 16. Senegal is going to be playing tomorrow, and then followed by Ghana and the rest. I hope maybe 5 out of the 9 African teams currently in the World Cup, or 5 out of the 8 African teams currently in the World Cup, I hope they succeed and make it to the round of 16. Which, in this case, this would be a history for Africa. But watching the game between Norway and the Ivory Coast, I believe that Norway basically played as if they wanted to play. Ivory Coast played a very strong game, very good game. Their defense was very good, but for some reason the offense could not finish. Ivory Coast had several chances, which once again did not and could not finish. But for Norway, I don't think, even though they play a good game, I don't think they were the best team on the field. I think Ivory Coast was much better than Norway. Yes, within the first 15 to 20 minutes of the first half, Norway basically played. And then Ivory Coast took over. However, towards the end of the game, especially after Norway scored the second goal, they basically got a momentum and they were playing a heck of a defense and basically was threatening the Ivorian defense. However, when Ivory Coast equalized, when Ivory Coast scored their one goal, you could see that Norway perhaps became scared. They were very much careful. They began to defend heavily than they did in the first half. However, Ivory Coast kept pushing and pushing, but could not finish. Yes, this was a disappointing defeat for Ivory Coast, and I believe for many Africans supporting Ivory Coast, representing Africa. However, Norway basically won the game. Norway deserved to win. And from what I've learned, that this was the first time Norway had defeated any country, any team in the knockout stage. Kudos to Norway. Kudos to Haaland, who scored the second goal. You guys deserve it. Now, friends, please tell me what you think. And I really, my friends, I really want to know what you think. However, friends, I am going to end here. I want to thank you for being a member of the Echoing Voice community, my friends. But most especially and most importantly, or most important, my friends, I want to thank you a lot for watching the Echoing Voice. Peace, my friends. Peace.